I'm an Orthodox Catholic, but it opens me up to, I think, deeper relationships and friendships with people, including people who, see things very differently from me.
Well, I'll be honest. There have been times over the years as you've gone down this path that you've pissed me off, and it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed that I still consider you a friend. Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, an exploration of the Hamilton College experience. This week's guest is Nathaniel Hurd, class of 1999. I'm sorry. If you're looking for a show last week, I'm sorry. What can I say? Shit happens. It's 2020. I'm sorry, but I'm back. We're here this week. And it's a good one this week. And I think it's a good one as we're deep into the holiday season and headed for, hopefully, a well-earned break for many of you. And obviously for many, this holiday season is a deeply religious time. And religion is something that really hasn't been covered on this show. But we will this week. But before I talk about this week's guest, I want to remind you to stick around for the end of the show, where we'll continue to highlight Hamilton musicians. This week, it's Bo Armstrong, class of 2009. Some new music from Bo. After my conversation with Nathaniel Hurd, class of 99. Now, Nathaniel is someone that I knew pretty well at Hamilton. We lived across the hall from each other our first year in North, played rugby together for a bit, and we co-hosted a radio show with two other friends for, it had to be at least 5 semesters. So I knew Nathaniel pretty well. And for the 4 years I knew him in college, I knew him to be an extremely liberal, and I think he made it known that he was an atheist. So it came as an utter shock to me several years out of college when news started to spread that not only had he quite literally found religion, but had started to head down a path to become a priest. Now, I should say, my reaction to Nate's journey of faith was shaped largely by my own experience with the Catholic Church. I went to a Catholic elementary school from pre-K through 6th grade. I was an altar boy, First Communion, confirmation. I was all in. But I had always had questions that I never felt were properly answered as I was growing up in the Catholic Church. And then had a few instances that really turned me off and made me walk away, not the least of which was when the priest who laid my father to his final resting place was caught up in one of those scandals you hear about Catholic priests, and just a horrific, horrific story. And the way in which it was handled by my parish and the church at large really just turned me off. And so any doubts that I had kind of been solidified, and I had decided to move on. Now, in doing so, had never, and still never, pass any judgment on anyone who has any religious beliefs. It's whatever someone wants to believe is up to them, and good on them for believing what they believe. In my view, it was live by the golden rule, and everything else will work itself out. But when Nate had made it known that this was the path he had chosen, and had become in many instances very vocal about his beliefs, and you'll hear me talk about this with him, I was taken aback. And in some cases, he and I would butt head over real differences of belief. But in preparing for this conversation, I came to the realization that I never really tried to understand what was behind what Nate was going through, what his beliefs really were, why they were what they were, and what it meant for him. So in many ways, this is a show about the paths people take post-Hamilton, and Nate's got a fascinating one. So I wanted to get into it and find out more about it, and find out how his journey of faith impacts the work he does today as a senior policy advisor at the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, otherwise known as the US Helsinki Commission. And in that role, Nate's efforts actually focus on international freedom of religion issues. And it was interesting to hear about some of that work. So while there are things that we likely will never see eye to eye on, it was nice to connect with Nathaniel on a level that proved that despite differences of belief, we can still be friends and still find points of connection to continue that friendship. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Nathaniel Hurd, class of 1999.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
I walked down the stairs with the words of my wife, "Don't say anything that'll make you go viral."
Well, I couldn't disagree with her more.
That's right. She's not on the production side of things. Doesn't understand the marketing aspect.
Oh man, it's been a long time.
Wow, so much has changed. Yeah, the invitation has. I've reflected a lot on, probably more than I have in years, about my time at Hamilton. Because I mean, ultimately, I went in with an expectation about what the experience was going to be like, which in most aspects of life is actually probably a mistake. You should just let it happen, rather than presuming to know what it's going to be like. But I think, so growing up, my dad was kind of the model of the well-rounded guy. Here you had, this man. He got a PhD in economics. He was a university professor. But when he was in high school and college, he had worked construction. Well, some of his friends were out, like playing tennis in the summer. He was doing things like that. He and a buddy of his worked their way across the country twice, basically doing like migrant labor, working in farms and pea packing plants and stuff like that. He'd been an athlete his whole life, but he loved classical music and art and loved working with his hands. And so he was always like the well-rounded guy for me. And I think, especially after having gone to a boarding school, where people like me were there more for the academic structure. There were some guys that have been sent for the social structure, and some of them were just into some really, it's sort of like, you've ever read Lord of the Flies? It was like Lord of the Flies, except we were wearing ties. That was kind of the main difference. And so I think I had this kind of desire and hope and expectation when I went to Hamilton that, okay, here you have some of the brightest people in the United States, interesting, people who are, into sports, but also like interesting conversations. And I sort of had probably this sort of romanticized, idealized notion of what it was going to be like. And it was weird because, we'd be in class and people would be having these, kind of rich conversations, and you walk out of the door and it would just end. And like, all right, we're not in class anymore. We can't be talking about those things anymore. We've got to kind of switch into something that, maybe is a little bit more superficial. So I think I think that was somewhat of a challenge. I think also, as a teetotaler, and if I remember rightly, you were a fellow teetotaler as well. But I didn't drink in high school. And I knew that people were going to drink a bit in college, but that really was sort of jarring. Of just like in Friday night or Saturday night or something like that, like just how kind of dominant that was. And so, being an only child, I was used to spending time by myself and so on. But I think my experience, I think I probably, I certainly had friends, including some close ones, but I think I probably sort of, in certain ways, kept a little bit of a distance, more than I probably would have liked while I was there.
Did you feel like there's a lot to unpack there? So we're gonna go back to a lot of those things.
Yeah, just to hurl it all at you.
I love it. So you mentioned that your expectations weren't necessarily met when you got to the school. Were those shaped by the prep school experience? Did you expect something different and got more prep school, or what was the?
I think I expected something. I think I honestly, I get again. I probably was just naive. I think I just expected more. I'd gone to school with some, a lot of guys that were just very immature. Not like I was the paragon of maturity, but maybe a little bit more than some of those guys.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had sort of expected that going in. But honestly, I just. There's probably a case of, okay, I want it to be this way, and so it's going to be this way, rather than, no, actually most colleges, it's kind of like this. Big, small, elite, non-elite, there are some things that are pretty common.
Was it a case of, it was obvious to those who got to know you early on, there was a maturity to you that you were a more mature college and first year college student than many. So didn't drink in high school, and you felt like you were going to college to now have a different level of intellectual experience that didn't happen as much because it was still party.
I mean, it was personally that, it was personally intellectual, but also I think I just had this idea, again, probably shaped by my dad, of kind of a lot of really well-rounded people who, you could be up, until 2 a.m, have a really interesting conversation about something, and like screaming your lungs out at the football game or the basketball game the next day. Same people, rather than this kind of things being somewhat separated. Oh my gosh. I mean, if it had been a place where it was just people like sitting around talking books, I would have gone crazy. But it was that kind of desire for people to just be, interested in a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm. So the prep school was Trinity Pauling, correct?
Trinity Pauling School for Boys, otherwise known. Yeah. We would sometimes call it Trinity Pauling School for Boys and no girls, just to make it clear that there were no girls there. Yeah, Trinity Pauling.
And your dad was, where did your dad teach in Vermont?
He did. So Vermont is an institution called Norwich University, which was founded as a private military institution. Really sort of interesting, not part of the service academy system, but still, preparing originally men for the military services. Norwich integrated African Americans long before the service institutions. They went co-ed long before the service institutions. Really sort of fascinating history. But here was my dad, who, he taught economics. He had never been in the military. I was not even allowed to have water guns when I was growing up. This is kind of my, parents' ideas about these things. But he wore a military uniform every day for, 35 years or whatever it was. Had to keep his hair cut in a certain way. But my dad, that was his career, at least as long as I was alive. He worked at Norwich University.
And did he have, given what he knew about higher ed, did he have an influence on your choice of school?
So growing up in the Hurd household, where to begin? So, my dad was an academic. My mom was also a PhD as well. She was a Renaissance art historian. She went more the museum route than the teaching route. But in the Hurd house, as soon as I was basically able to string a few sentences together, I was expected to be able to come to the meal table ready to debate and discuss whatever it was. And so, and also because my mom and dad had me when they were a bit older. My mom, I think, was 41 when she had me. The children of their friends were often older than I was. And so I spent a lot of time hanging out with adults. I was sitting at the adults table talking with them, and not as much hanging out with their kids. The kids didn't want to hang out with me, like it was a little, twerp, and so, that was something that I think was also very formative for me. Just at home, my parents sort of treating me like an adult in certain ways, having these kind of adult conversations, but also with their friends as well.
Well, that's interesting. And that goes back to, when we all got to know you early on, I was like, man, this guy feels like he's like a 40-year-old in a 20-year-old body.
It was at least starting in high school when the kind of informal nickname developed. Oh, it's the old man. So there it goes. But the one thing for me about growing up as an only child was that, and growing up in a somewhat rural area, I certainly had friends and would spend plenty of time with them, but I also spent a lot of time by myself, whether it was, like working in the garden or, wandering through the woods or whatever it was. And so like, I was totally comfortable being on my own. I never felt sort of compelled. I'm an extrovert. I enjoy being around people, but if, it was a Friday night or Saturday night, and I was, shooting hoops in the gym, practicing for the Snapple Challenge, which you may remember, it didn't bother me at all.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many.
I was actually pretty grateful for.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have so many memories of, because same, again, only child, same as you, and I would long for sometimes just breakfast at Commons by myself, or lunch for 20 minutes by myself, whatever it may be, and no one would ever allow that to happen because I guess the feeling was that it was the saddest thing if you were sitting eating by yourself in the dining hall, and I would just want to sit there and read Spectator or just the Daily Bull for a few minutes and just be by myself. And oh, you're by yourself, let me come join you. And oh, great, thanks.
Right. Just give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes.
Right. How then did you?
I mean, actually, sorry, one other quick thing.
Go ahead.
This is actually one of the reasons. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I decided to study abroad for the entire year instead of half a year. Just to kind of get away for a bit. I thought that my senior year would be a lot better if I'd had the opportunity to experience something else in a more sustained way. And one of the challenges when you're abroad for half a year is just when you're entering into the place where you are, the community, the life, you then have to go back. And so I thought, one, I want to be able to really enter in, but also I think it would be good for me to kind of be away for a year. And it was absolutely the case. I mean, I came back very different in a lot of ways.
Where did you go?
I went to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
Right. Yeah, as someone who didn't go abroad, I did always sense when people would come back of, and it was probably my jealousy because I wanted to go away and didn't, but just this people coming back thinking they're all hot shit. I'm so mature now. I spent time in Europe.
Yeah. No, I mean, for me, the weird. So it was funny. One of the reasons that I was sent to boarding school was that my mom and dad. When I was in middle school, if I liked a class, I would work hard. I would usually do pretty well, and if I didn't like it, I just would put in zero effort. Now, when your parents are Dr. Hurd and Dr. Hurd, this is not an option. And their real concern was actually not as much my grades per se. It was the fact that they just didn't see me reaching my potential. And so they were concerned that if I went to the public school and I was sort of bored, then I would just sort of fall through the cracks. And they also suspected that I might have a learning disability. And so I got tested for it, and it turned out that I did. And so one of the reasons that I went to this particular boarding school was they had a very good program for students with learning disabilities. And so, I learned all these sort of techniques and ways of compensating for it, developed a much more consistent work ethic, did well academically. But then I went to Hamilton, and for some bizarre reason, like my first 2 years, strictly similar to back in the day. If I enjoyed a class, I would, I'd usually put a lot of effort into it and do well. And if I didn't, I just didn't do very much. I sort of underachieved in some of my classes, not obviously because I was drinking the nights away, but just because I wasn't. But when I went abroad, the classes were seminar style. So you basically you'd have one or two assigned texts and then a menu of things that you could choose from, basically like whatever you found interesting, and then you would just talk about it in a moderated discussion with a small group for about 2 hours, which was just absolutely fascinating for me. I had a chance to read all these things I hadn't been exposed to. And then outside of that, just developed a lot of really close friendships. I had the chance to travel a little bit. So when I came back to Hamilton, I was on fire. I was interested in my classes. I was working hard. I was kind of engaged with, kind of the current affairs. It was very different. My senior year was actually very different from my first 2 years.
And was it that travel that ignited the foreign affairs, foreign policy sort of itch?
So my mom and dad had lived all over the world before I was even born, and growing in Vermont is it's not the most international state in the world. Just to dispel any. But when I was growing up in Vermont, it's a very rural state and fairly rural area. The world was in our house. My parents were always telling these fabulous stories of places they'd been and people they knew and experiences that they'd had. So that certainly was part of the interest and the curiosity. When I was age 9 to 11, we lived in India for 2 years. My dad's area of research and interest over the decades was in India. This is the third time that they were living there. And so we lived in one of the biggest cities in India, fifth biggest city, I think it was, Hyderabad, India. And my parents did something very different. A lot of people, when they live abroad, live in an expat bubble. Mm-hmm. My mom and dad were never interested in that. They hadn't lived that way in their first 2 trips to India, and they certainly weren't going to in this time. So basically, they certainly had some American friends and some international friends, and most of their friends were Indian, I mean, the elites of the city, but Indian. And instead of sending me to an American school or an Indian or international school, they sent me to an Indian school. Again, elite school, but I was the only non-Indian in my school. Wow. When I was interacting with my classmates, I just kind of switched over to the way that they were talking. So if you can imagine this, pasty white, 9-year-old speaking with a thick South Indian accent, that was me. And so and obviously India, I mean, it's unlike anything that I had ever experienced before. I mean, sights and smells and personal space and animal wandering across. I mean, just everything is so different. And I think that also really planted a seed for me. And, by the time I got to Hamilton, it was very clear I was going to be a government major. It was very clear that I was going to be an international relations major. And I was always kind of really, I don't know where this came from, but I was always really interested in questions of justice. And I don't know where that came from. And if you were to sort of ask me, like, what's that based on? I'm not sure I would have been able to give you a coherent answer, but there it was. And so I was always sort of probing the relationship between U.S. foreign policy and the consequences for people in different parts of the world. And so when I came back to Hamilton, and that was something that I really had a chance to dig into when I was in Scotland for the year. And that was a big preoccupation my senior year as well. Wow.
Did you, as a 9-year-old thrust into another country, were you embraced it and enjoyed it? Did you not know any better, or were you frightened?
Well, I mean, it's funny. When I still remember, age 9, we got out of the airport and, in America, we're used to a certain sense of personal space. I've kind of got my space. You're sort of over there. I'm over here. Didn't exist. And so we got out of the airport and, there were cab drivers who came right up to us and, we'd just gotten off this super long flight and we were jet lagged and tired. And somebody just right in your face asking if you wanted a cab. They weren't doing it, they weren't trying to intimidate you, but that's just a very different kind of personal space. Or, it was a favorite pastime of women above a certain age to pinch the cheeks of little children, which drove me absolutely crazy. So, I mean, it was a totally different experience. But, I would say, especially once I started going to school and developed friends and was playing sports, this is where I learned how to play cricket. I played a ton of cricket pickup cricket when I was living in India. In fact, when I came back to the U.S. and had little league tryouts, the coaches would be throwing pitches, and every once in a while one would bounce in the dirt, and I would just hit it because that's what you did when you played cricket. And Nathaniel, you don't have to swing at it; you can just let it go. Just let it go. But I would say I embraced it. I embrace it. I mean, it's just such a fascinating place. And I think also, having a father and mother who were also fascinated and inquisitive and curious about things, I'm sure, helped with that.
What was re-entry like when you moved back to the States?
It was jarring. You know, it was true then. What I'm about to say was true then, and has been true actually in my work over the years. And we'll probably talk about this later. But I mean, it's true that going to India, you know, immediately it was kind of shocking in some ways. But the coming back is, in many respects, even harder, because this life, this place that I mean, there are a lot of things that you just don't notice or think about very deeply. Suddenly, you do. I mean, for example, the fact that, you know, just there are obviously people who are poor in the United States, urban and rural, but there's nothing like what you observe in India.
Oh, we have no idea.
No idea.
I've spent very little time in India, but the little bit time that I was there, oh my God.
I mean, it's just, I mean, it's you know, it's very hard to sort of, you know, people like, you know, entire family living in like a, you know,
under a bridge
hut under a bridge, you know, I mean, so, you know, and suddenly, you know, you're back in the United States and, you know, everybody's got a car, and you go to the grocery store and you got, you know, 15 kinds of peanut butter. And I mean, just that, there was that. There was also the fact that I had been away for 2 years. And so, you know, the friendships that had developed between my peers, or, you know, being on sports teams, all of that, like I had totally missed it. There's like this chunk of the 80s that, you know, people will, you know, pop culture, whatever it may be, that I picked up later on, but I just was totally foreign and alien to me. And I was that kind of weird kid who'd been away in India for 2 years. And so, you know, there was that aspect too. So it was a little hard at first. And actually, I mean, sports, and coming from an academic family and bringing, you know, like we ate interesting food at home, but it wasn't always sort of the typical American fare. And I'd bring this stuff to school and get kind of heckled about it. Like, it's this weird stuff you're bringing. But as an athlete, and one who, you know, at the time was good, that was something that I think forced my friends and peers to maybe look at me a little bit different. All right, you know, he's got this kind of weird family. He went to India, but, you know, he's pretty good at sports. So maybe we'll kind of cut him some slack.
Yeah. So you come back from Scotland, you're reignited, reengaged in school, knowing, I imagine that solidified your desire to get into international relations. So what's the plan and the path from there?
That was a funny thing. I didn't really have a plan. It was my senior year, and I didn't know. I knew that I wanted to work on, well, at least I thought I wanted to do foreign affairs stuff, although I was kind of looking at some domestic things as well. But I knew that I wanted to work in foreign affairs, and I didn't know where to go and what to do. And so, a friend of mine who was the president of the International Students Association at the time, Pakistani woman, Sheeta Najmi, asked me to help publicize and coordinate a talk. An external speaker, a guy who's coming to talk about basically the humanitarian situation in Iraq. You had Iraqi civilians, particularly children under the age of 5, who were sort of caught between, you know, this sort of terribly repressive dictator and international sanctions that were being led by the US, that were trying to you know, push the Iraqi government to let go of its non-conventional weapons and you know, give the international community a clear picture of what they were up to. And, you know, the regime would kind of cooperate somewhat, but not enough to lift sanctions. And so civilians are being stuck in the middle of this and really suffering badly, especially coming on the heels of the Gulf War. And so, you know, I didn't know anything about this. I was kind of scandalized by the whole thing. And one thing, you know, I remember one of the most sort of impactful, the moment that I will never forget, being in the library on campus my senior year, and I had really done a lot of reading about the Rwandan genocide. I know, kind of a weird thing to read in your free time, but there it was. And specifically about like U.S. policy and the U.S. policy of not really responding and sort of also getting in the way of other people responding as well, even though there were all kinds of signs in advance that this was going to happen. And I remember reading Bill Clinton, president at the time, had just gone on this tour of Africa, and he'd gone to Rwanda, and he was in the airport on the tarmac. He was giving this big speech, and he said, it was kind of an apology. He said, like, what happened to you? It happened so fast. We were in our offices, and it sort of overwhelmed us. We didn't sort of know what was going on. I had just read a newspaper article about a CIA report that had come out well before the genocide, saying, like, this is the intel we're getting. There were signs that something is up, possible major violence, hundreds of thousands of people may die, et cetera, et cetera. So, there was definitely an awareness, and there were other signs of it as well. And yet, he was sort of saying, like, oh, yeah, we just had no idea. And what sort of struck me was, no, like, every person has inherent worth and dignity. Their worth and dignity doesn't depend on where in the world they live. It doesn't depend on whether they happen to live in a place that's of strategic value to the United States or is in the country of one of our allies. And I had a really kind of visceral reaction to it. And so anyway, so here was this Iraq thing, and I thought, gosh, this is kind of awful. Surely there's going to be a way of making sure that Iraq doesn't have, nuclear weapons and chemical and biological weapons, but in a way that doesn't harm the civilians, particularly children. And so, we brought the speaker to campus. He had graduated just the year before from the University of Chicago. He'd done a lot of kind of advocacy and organizing on this subject. Graduated, was working for a big economic consulting firm in Boston, but still very much engaged on the side. And so he and I, we started talking, we hit it off, we kept in touch. And he said, look, I'm thinking of starting a very small scale research project, kind of on the side, to underpin the advocacy that's being done in this, to make sure that people have the most accurate and useful information, the best analysis. And I said, I'm in. And so I moved to Boston. I was sleeping on a mattress on his living room floor for about a year, and then we eventually found another place. But working out of donated office space in the attic of a building, and just spent the year turning myself into an expert on all aspects of U.S. and United Nations Iraq policy, developing relationships with experts, with journalists, and others. And that led to being able to continue this work, working for a small human rights nonprofit in New York.
It's interesting. When you're doing that, who is tapping into your research? You mentioned the media. Were you briefing the media? What was the...
Yeah, so there were individuals and organizations that were likewise concerned about the situation for civilians, and so I developed a network and developed relationships, and I was basically the guy who was reading the 300-page reports that other people didn't have time or interest to read, and sort of pulling out of that, like, okay, what's useful for the advocacy and policy work that's being done. And then the journalists, that was always, it wasn't on the record. It was always on sort of deep background. Now, clearly, I was an advocate. I had a perspective. There was a policy outcome that I wanted, but I was also committed to the truth of things. I was never going to spin something. I was never going to say something to a journalist that I didn't know to be factually true. I would, to the greatest extent that I could, I would source everything that I would give them, just so, okay, don't take my word for it, double check yourself. And so those were sort of the main outlets. And then when I came to New York, I was working for this nonprofit. It was such a weird time. I was, a lot of my engagement was with senior diplomats from diplomatic missions to the UN, and particularly missions that were on the UN Security Council at the time, the staffers, the different UN agencies, places like UNICEF, the World Food Program, journalists as well. So here I was, this 20-something-year-old, like in my early 20s. I didn't have a graduate degree. I was working for a small nonprofit that most of them had probably never heard of before. And here I was, and it was actually a really early education in the importance of relationships and how those can make your work a lot more fruitful. So, for example, okay, I want to reach out. I want to meet with a senior person for the French mission to the UN. I don't know anybody at the French mission, and some random guy. They're not going to meet with me. So, who do I know? Who knows somebody at the French mission? Ask them to make the introduction. Okay, they've made the introduction. I go in and I meet with them. But how do I sort of make it clear that I have some expertise, but do it in a way that's not obnoxious? Kind of that, I'm going to tell you everything that I know for the next 10 minutes while you listen. And so I would just ask a lot of very specific, granular questions that I genuinely wanted to have an answer to, but no one would know to ask those questions unless they had the expertise. I had basically gone very deep on a very narrow subject, and so I knew my stuff. I had these relationships with people. I had access to information that a lot of other people didn't. And so that is what enabled me to develop these relationships and for people to take me seriously, whether it was the senior diplomats or the journalists.
And then after doing that for a while, is the thought, okay, I'm going to go find the next issue to tackle, or are you envisioning a certain type of career as you start to get into this work?
This is a great question. I mean, I've never been a careerist. There were people in Washington who, even at a young age, all right, I've got my 5-year plan or my 10-year plan, which sounds like something out of the Soviet Union or Maoist China or something like that. I mean, I was never like that. There was always, almost every professional opportunity that I've ever had has been a surprise. It was something that I didn't expect. It was something I didn't necessarily seek. And so, here I was doing this Iraq work in the context. This was before the Iraq War of 2003. Now, as things began to build, I became concerned that you had the civilian population that was already, again, still the same repressive dictatorship. They're still hurting from sanctions. Infant mortality rates had doubled over this time period. People were still in a bad way. And here's the possibility of a large-scale military intervention that could, have devastating consequences for civilians. And nobody was really publicly talking about what would the implications of this be for Iraqis themselves. They would bear the biggest brunt of this. And so that was one aspect. And then there was the question of, okay, we're being told that Iraq poses an imminent threat, an imminent nuclear, chemical, biological weapons threat to the United States and our allies, and we've got to do something about that. Basically, the Bush administration would have had to prove that somehow over the intervening years, Iraq had managed to reconstitute these weapons programs to an industrial scale without anybody in the world having any idea that they were doing it. And they just weren't providing evidence for that. So one case is being made that those of us that really follow these things carefully just don't find credible. And you have the prospect of a war that would just be devastating for civilians. So it was at that point that I sort of shifted over from speaking to journalists on deep background where, your name is never mentioned, there's never any reference to you, to actually doing things on the record, to appearing on television, on camera, and doing radio programs and print broadcasts and all this sort of stuff, because it wasn't something that I craved. It wasn't something that I wanted, but I thought it was just really important that people be putting Iraqi civilians at the center of things. So, yeah.
How much did your time as a co-host of the Bleacher Creatures on WHCL help in your media appearances?
Well, one, I was disappointed that Dave from Clinton never called. That was disappointing. I think it was certainly helpful. I mean, just being sort of comfortable talking and knowing that more than the person who's in the room with you is hearing what you're saying. Now, obviously, the audience of CNN is a little bigger than, WHCL.
I don't know. Bleacher Creatures were a popular program name. Don't say so.
That's true. And we were on Clinton's #1 radio station.
That's right. That's exactly right. And by the way, you are now as well. So welcome back to WHCL.
Cheers. Yeah, it's still #1. No, just super helpful, super helpful. And I mean, one, that was great preparation. I think also the fact that I knew my stuff was, I mean, when you're talking about things that you know deeply, it's just easy to talk about those things. I mean, I had some funny experiences. You know, I was on, it was a BBC, it was a television interview, and like my earpiece just like flew out of my ear right in the middle of it. This is the hazard of having sort of Spock-like, you know, elf-like ears. There's no earpiece that kind of fits in well to your ears. Just kind of flew out, and, you know, okay, just put it back in, keep going. I did get caught smirking on camera once. That was not good. There was some other guy who was being beamed in from some think tank in DC, and he was saying something that I thought was somewhat ridiculous. Don't smirk on camera. It's just never, ever good, but there you have it. Yeah, so I was doing that, but, and then, you know, obviously the war happened, and then, you know, the things changed. I mean, sanctions were lifted because the regime wasn't there anymore. But I finally, to your question, I finally hit a point where I wasn't sure that I wanted to focus on Iraq for the rest of my life, but I mean, it was all Iraq all the time. I had been so absorbed with this, and there's such a vocational dimension to it that I hadn't thought about anything else. I hadn't thought about what I wanted to do other than this. And so that's when I made the decision to go to grad school.
What was the thought behind what you were going to do with that?
First and foremost, I wanted a time just to breathe. I wanted a time just to be able to think. And so it was great. So I went to Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. Half the student body was from outside the United States, so a really dynamic, rich environment there. People who had done, you know, like worked in government ministries or for companies or nonprofits, or Americans that had worked for Peace Corps or in the U.S. government, and a lot of really interesting backgrounds were brought to the experience there. And the other thing that was great about the school was that they basically didn't take people just out of undergrad. The average age of somebody when I was there was 27, so an average of 5 years of work experience, which was just fantastic. But you know, I thought, okay, this is a chance for me to, you know, be exposed to different things, try different things. I started out, my concentration was national security policy, but then I thought, well, if I ever want to do domestic stuff, I'm not sure how useful this is going to be. And so I switched over, interestingly, to media and communications, particularly communications, because, you know, I thought, what was it that I enjoyed the most about my job? And one of the things I really enjoyed were these conversations that I'd had with journalists and engaging with journalists. And so I thought, well, maybe it's communication. So I was able to, thanks to the flexibility of my degree program, I was able to take classes at the journalism school. I took a speech writing class, did some original reporting. So my writing, which was already, you know, pretty solid, certainly improved. But in the end, what I realized was I didn't want to do communications. I really wanted to go back to doing the advocacy and policy stuff, because I really, you know, craved and thrived the depth that I had when I was doing that Iraq work. And I never presumed that I would necessarily, you know, go as deep on something as I had then. But that was something that I really missed. And so ultimately, that's what led me back to the world of advocacy and policy, ultimately in Washington, D.C.
But I imagine some of that communications training helps.
Absolutely. So I basically ended up working for big international relief and development organizations, doing advocacy and policy work for them. And so you're actually working very closely with the communications team. You're sometimes drafting press releases, or at least reviewing press releases. You're developing talking points for senior people in the organization. Sometimes you may be speaking on the record yourself and engaging with journalists. So you end up actually doing a lot of writing and communication stuff, but it's not. A lot of it's more on the informal side of things, but it was absolutely indispensable in the work that I did and do now.
And then somewhere along the lines, everyone started to say, "Hey, did you hear that Nathaniel Hurd's going to be a priest?"
Yeah,
that was a different turn.
Yeah, probably as shocking to me as it was to them. Yeah, I mean. The sort of very short version is that, you know, my mother's side of the family, Orthodox Jewish, actually. She grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household in Omaha, Nebraska. She's been an atheist for most of her life, probably starting in her teenage years. Not not really a woman of religious faith. My dad's family, their pairing was very funny. So you had the daughter of Jewish immigrants from kind of Belarus and Lithuania on the one side. On the other side, my dad's family settled in Massachusetts in the 1600s. So clearly not Jews from Belarus and Lithuania. He was Episcopalian growing up, but religion. My dad, I'd say, was an agnostic when I was growing up. It was just never. It was kind of maybe an oddity or a curiosity, but it was just that was something that other people did. It was. I think ultimately my mom and dad didn't have a very rich and full understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. They thought faith and reason were incompatible, or science and faith were incompatible. And so that was just sort of what I absorbed growing up. So I was actually an atheist when I was when I was in middle school and high school and certainly in college. I was a hardcore atheist. Anyone who was otherwise was deluded, had to, if they were an intelligent person, they had to have switched off their brain in order to, for these things to make any sense to them. And so that was basically up until through my senior year. And then I stayed at Hamilton just after graduating to help out with the chief archivist, Frank Lorenz, at the time. And I became very good friends with a Catholic guy who was a year below me. And we ended up having a lot of conversations about faith, about religion. And I couldn't dismiss him as being an idiot. He was Phi Beta Kappa, double major in psychology and classics, very smart guy, very articulate in talking about God and talking about his faith. And so by the end of the summer, I'd sort of lost my conviction. I'd lost my certainty that there was no God. But at that point, okay, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I just have no idea. Moved to Boston, was doing this work with this person, this guy, on Rahman, who became actually a very, very dear friend of mine. And, was kind of plugging along and, having conversations about faith with other people. But yeah, I had a very kind of dramatic Paul on the road to Damascus, encounter when I was on a long run, visiting my mom and dad. And it was very funny. The first conversation with God was basically, "Hello there. Sorry, I've been ignoring you for the last 20-something years. Thanks for not giving up on me. So, okay, well, what do I do with this?" And it was also it wasn't God and kind of, and I should say, by the way, having referred to Paul on the road to Damascus, I didn't go blind, I didn't hear a voice, didn't fall down, just to be very clear. But I wouldn't say it was sort of the start of belief. It was sort of the start of recognition. When you walk into a room and there's a table, you don't say, "Well, I believe that there's a table there." "Oh, there's a table there." It was more like that. It was just sort of a recognition of something and someone that was real and true and in front of me. And so,
was there something else? Yeah. Sorry, was there something else that was? Yeah. I feel like the stereotypical, and I don't mean to say that because that has a negative connotation, but this typical story I think one hears is someone's downtrodden, or someone has hit rock bottom, or someone has had this questioning something, or something shakes them to question their beliefs and open their minds to something else. But from an outsider's perspective, you're building an interesting career.
This is before grad school. This was
before grad school.
This was actually long before grad school. This was several years before grad school. This would have been 2001. I went to grad school, started in 2004, so this would have been in 2001, kind of the winter of 2001. I'd been having conversations about faith with people, because I wondered. I had this question. The interesting thing was I wasn't even having most of these conversations with Christians. I had, this friend of mine who was a Pakistani Muslim. There was a colleague of mine who was American, Indian born, but parents moved to the States early on. She was a Muslim as well. And so, a lot of the conversations were sort of in that context, although certainly ranged to Judaism and Christianity as well. But, I wasn't reading the Bible. I wasn't reading Christian authors. Certainly growing up in the U.S., this is kind of in the air more than any other faith. But it wasn't on my mind. And this is the thing that was so striking for me was, I was on this run and suddenly, and even when I started the run, I was just thinking about totally unrelated things. But, like what was very clear was God exists, and it's not just this kind of amorphous entity, three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And it was just a fact. It was sort of undeniable. Now, that said, you can have a very dramatic experience, but ultimately, if something is true, it isn't just true in that moment. It will continue to be so. And so it should be able to withstand testing over time. In other words, you're not just going to have this one-off experience and then, okay, well, that's it. No, actually, you will see sort of continued evidence of this over the days and weeks and months. And so I went back to New York and said, okay, I guess I should start going to church. And so there's this church that's been recommended, Episcopalian church, which is a tradition that the boarding school that I'd gone to was Episcopalian. It was a tradition I was somewhat familiar with. And so I started going there, went there every Sunday and was pretty involved. But it ended up, I still, and this actually goes back to the Hamilton experience a little bit. I still saw myself as being somewhat, in a very sort of prideful way, being somewhat sort of different from the people that were around me. I'd sort of set myself apart in some respects. I hadn't really entered in fully into the life of the parish.
But what's that? That's a mindset of. Well, I'm open and I believe this, but I'm not like I don't believe it like those people. Like, was it that sort of mindset?
Maybe to some extent. I think it was more, one of the things that I had struggled with then, and, that to some extent may always struggle with is pride. And we all struggle with pride to some degree. Mm-hmm. But, I had grown up in this very intellectual family where, the intellect was idolized to some extent, where you're sort of obsessed with words and obsessed with intelligence and all these things. And so if I had thought something through, your window to convince me otherwise was very small because, I had thought it through, and it's just very clear. And so, my notions of things, even by that point as a person of faith, I got baptized there, were very much self-referential, rather than the faith primarily being something sort of received that I was responding to. It was something that to some extent I had kind of quasi-generated myself. And what I sort of realized was, I was still very the same person in a lot of respects. I hadn't realized that, actually, yes, it's true that God changes you, but you also are a collaborator with him. There's co-workers in the vineyard. Mm-hmm. And it's not like you just sort of go to Sunday and listen to stuff and, okay, well, I'm good. And things just sort of happen. There's a work that goes into it, like any relationship. And I wasn't really doing that. And I was seeing how I was still living my life in ways that I were probably not ideal. And I also sort of I started to get this notion that, I was only at this church that I was going to, that I was only getting part of the story of, the gospel and the Christian life, because there were certain aspects of life, and some of the more kind of contentious cultural things that we talk about now, human sexuality and marriage and all these things, where what I was basically being told was, believe whatever you want to believe. Wait a minute. I tried that for years. It didn't go very well. And I'm not interested in, just sort of me being my main point of reference. I'm like, okay, I want to know what the teachings of Jesus Christ are, and I want to follow those. But you're telling me believe whatever I want to believe. There isn't sort of something that's not particularly objective. And so ultimately I stopped going there. My faith in myself was actually shaken, which was actually a good thing. I mean, I had relied on myself far too much over the years. And so that was a good thing, but it stopped going. And ultimately my work led me to a friendship with a Catholic guy, who was he was a fascinating person. He, back to our earlier part of the conversation about kind of the well-rounded person. He was somebody who, a New Yorker, native New Yorker, was as happy and comfortable at a baseball game as he was at a museum, read widely, just a really fascinating person. So we ended up having a lot of conversations about this stuff. And, partially through that friendship, a very kind of dramatic Good Friday experience about a year or two later. And I hadn't been to church in a long time. And I was very convicted that, I needed to go somewhere for Easter. And so I went to this friends who went to this Catholic church in New York. And I went to Mass. It was the Easter Vigil Mass, which is like the blockbuster Mass in the church's year. And I was totally transfixed by the whole thing. I mean, it absolutely blew me away. I mean, I was almost like stupefied watching this whole thing. And I came back.
What was it? What was it that drew you in?
It was the beauty of it. It was the fact that, you have this sort of mixture of smells and sounds and words that are just so rich. Everything, seemed to have a meaning. I didn't know exactly what the meaning was, but everything seemed to be done with a great deal of intentionality. I was struck by the fact that, I'd gone to this Episcopalian church and, everybody had their own like individual kneeling cushion. So it's like, if you want to kneel, you can. If you don't want to, well, that's fine too. You do whatever you want. Whereas here, there were parts of the Mass where, certainly when people came in and prayed, but parts of the Mass were like everybody went down. And that actually seemed to make sense, because if what's being proposed here is true, if this really is the Lord, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, well, you get down on your knees, and you think about it like even in a secular context, in older times when you would be in the presence of the monarch, you would sort of kneel, and that just seemed to make sense.
So there was a sense of if you truly believe, then you don't go part way. Exactly.
That's right. Yeah. Like this is like the full on, and it was like, there was a mystery about it as well, which was kind of intriguing. There was a seriousness about it. So I went back the next day. I went for Easter Sunday Mass, and I started revisiting all of the reasons why I had been closed to Catholicism over the years. And there were a number of things that sort of became clear. And one, I realized that, I had very strong opinions about some of the teachings of the church. But what I recognized was that my conscience and my understanding hadn't actually been very deeply formed by the teachings themselves. That I might have known the what at a very superficial level, but I didn't know what the why was.
Can you give me an example?
I would say, certainly, like why is it that, women can't be ordained, or, why is it that, the church says, two men can't be married, or, something like that, because, I was a man who believed in justice, and this just sort of seemed like monstrously unjust to me. And I didn't sort of know the why behind it. And so part of it was just learning the why, very much rooted in a certain understanding of the dignity of the human person and a whole range of other things. But maybe a big thing for me was, okay, here I am, it's 2004. I know I want to follow Jesus in my daily life. How do I do that? Well, I've got all these different Protestant communities, which are, they're often saying things that are either internally contradictory, or at the very least, they're contradicting each other. Or, they've said, okay, we've believed this thing for, 500 years, but a committee has gone off and they voted on it, and we've decided it's not true anymore. And but there had to be a way that I, in 2004, could know sort of authoritatively what the teachings of Christ were. And it couldn't depend on the sanctity of the Pope or the bishops or the priests or anything like that. Certainly look at the history of the church, and there's plenty of scandal. And so what became clear was, going all the way back to St. Peter, he's only ever had wretched sinners to work with. Like, this is it. This is his material. And, if you're looking for like the perfect teacher or the perfect person or the person who is without, fault or flaw or sin or whatever it may be, you're not going to find it. So clearly he works and speaks through flawed creatures. And it's possible, like if there's a supernatural dimension to this, if it's not purely natural, if there's a supernatural dimension to this, he can speak to us through people who in some cases are sort of monstrously sinful. So certainly their conduct is not something to be emulated, but what they're saying is still true. And so I think that helps me get beyond sort of the scandals, either in recent times or, over the history of the church. And I looked at the continuity that the church is saying now, what she said 2,000 plus years ago and 500 years ago and 250 years ago, that, if these things are eternally true, then what the church says is going to be consistent over time. And so that was something that was very attractive. I was attracted to certainly the social doctrine of the church, certainly the insistence on, caring for the poor and so on, all of that. And so, ultimately it just became clear that, okay, I need to become Catholic. And did those,
but I'm curious, I'm curious about the struggle. So if you go back to, and forget about, Nathaniel at Hamilton, who was an atheist, but Nathaniel that at Hamilton that I knew was pretty staunchly liberal. And I think had a conversation about, two men getting married had come up in the in the basement TV room of North while watching your Canadians get their rear ends beaten by the Rangers.
I know.
I don't think actually that ever happened. Watching the Mets and Cardinals play, you would have staunchly defended the right for two men to get married. If I remember who you were back then.
Yes, absolutely. So, and it would have been rooted in sort of, a certain understanding of justice and my own experience and observation and so on. But I, in the end, what sort of shifted was not wanting to just sort of follow my own notions of things, and also not wanting to necessarily, just because this is where the culture is moving, that doesn't necessarily make something true. And again, if I wanted to follow Jesus, not according to my own sort of notions or what was convenient or popular, this is what was being asked of me. And so just to be open to that. And that was sort of the major shift. And I think also to some extent, when I was growing up, my mom and dad had always taught me to, not just sort of don't follow the crowd for the sake of following the crowd. Like, don't be a lemming. And it was interesting years later when it became clear that I was kind of on this path to becoming Catholic, it was very distressing for my mother. She has a lot of baggage about the church, growing up Jewish in Omaha, Nebraska in the 30s and 40s and 50s, obviously the history of the church with the Jewish people, just her experience of faith in her own family. She had experienced through her mother, who was kind of a very domineering personality. And so my mother always associated faith with like controlling people and about power and about dividing people. And so she, reacted very, very strongly. Like, if you become Catholic, I'm going to stop being your mother. And it was an actual quote. Or, I don't believe in evil. The church is evil. Or, like if you did this, it'd be worse than if you murdered somebody. I mean, these were literally words that came out of my mother's mouth. And my dad, he had his own kind of struggles with this as well. But it was an early test. But years later, my mother, she and I were on a long drive together, and she asked me, this is reference to me becoming Catholic. She said, so what did your father and I do wrong? And so of course I gave him full credit. for me becoming Catholic. I said, remember when you told me to not like just follow the crowd and, just sort of do what everybody else is doing just for the sake of following? I said, ta-da! Hard to think of something more countercultural than doing this. So I became 2005 became Catholic in New York. I actually started grad school and kind of the year-long formation process of becoming Catholic at the same time, which was actually really kind of perplexing to my grad school classmates. It was very funny because when they found out about this, there was always an awkward pause, and I knew what that pause meant. That pause was so, okay, like you're a peer, here we are at school together, we're in class together, you seem reasonably intelligent, and yet you're doing this. I don't see how these two things kind of fit together, which, so I explain things as best I could, but I also hope that by them knowing me, they would know that whatever notion or impression or stereotype they had, I was not that. I was a fact, and they could either sort of be open to that fact or just hang on to the stereotype and the impression. 2005, became Catholic, and then we moved to Washington, and I had started thinking about the priesthood pretty early on again, off again, on again, off again. And by the time 2009 rolled around, I was working at a big nonprofit. I actually had returned to doing Iraq focused work. It's just like The Godfather Part 3. Just when I thought it was out, they pulled me back in. So the question hadn't gone away. And it became clear to me that just like God was not going to leave me alone, that just because I was sort of kind of trying to push this question off to the side didn't mean that it was going to disappear. And that I also needed to really discern, more deeply and fully and to basically pull away from professional life. And so in summer of 2009, I went to seminary for the Archdiocese of Washington. So I was going to a seminary here in Washington, D.C. And it was a beautiful year. I just such a privileged time of prayer, growing closer to the Lord, seeing the world more through the eyes of the church. My gratitude and appreciation for the priesthood, for the gift of celibacy, for those who are called to it, only deepened and grew. But it also became very clear over time that was not my vocation. This was clear in prayer and daily experience and conversations that I was having with people. I even did a summer parish assignment in 2010. It was just kind of a last check just to see. But
and what was it? What was it that you felt wasn't that part of it wasn't for you?
So it wasn't that there was anything sort of lacking in the priesthood. It wasn't anything lacking in that vocation. I recognized it as being beautiful, as being a beautiful life. Some of the happiest people I knew, some of the happiest guys I knew were priests. But ultimately, if something is your vocation, there has to be an attraction to it. There has to be sort of a pull, a desire for it. And there was a desire to, get married and have kids and have a family. And so once that became clear, you can either try and live a vocation that's not yours and be unhappy, or you can live who and what God created you to be. And so I discerned out, and I also left with the confidence that if for some reason I had gotten it wrong, if for some reason, like the formators of the seminary had gotten it wrong, God would lead me back. And so I didn't need to worry about whether, and I also thought, like, if this is true, if this, my vocation is to be, kind of a natural husband and father, then he'll make that clear too. And that has been consistent ever since. And so I basically returned to professional life, and ultimately in 2014 got married.
So I dropped out of Catholic school in 6th grade. And I say that because that gives you a sense of what my level of intellectual understanding of religion is. It's about at about a 6th grade level. and I would often get in trouble in that school So it was a Catholic elementary school in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood on Long Island. So all of my neighbors were Jewish. And I would regularly ask if all of my neighbors were going to hell because they didn't believe what we
Yeah.
believed.
Yeah.
As a sixth grader, I didn't get a satisfactory answer to that. And I guess I tell that because it demonstrates a little bit of what I'm still trying to understand about you, Nathaniel, is someone who still works in fighting for religious, now even more so religious justice around the world. I imagine you're not only doing that for Catholics. So help me understand sort of that sixth grade
Yeah.
mentality I have of, well,
Yeah.
if you believe that so thoroughly,
Yeah.
if you are part of a religion that believes that men can't get married, but you're still fighting in places where people are getting persecuted for trying to do that,
Yeah.
homosexuals are persecuted, and you're fighting
Yeah.
for justice there. Help me. How do I rectify those two things?
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. That's a great question. So, I mean, one, going back to sixth grade. So this I think is where the difference between sort of the church's, okay, you have like the authoritative teaching, right? So this is like what we call the magisterium, the Pope sort of in unity with the bishops. There's sort of a continuity over the years. And then you sort of have, like what an individual priest might say, or an individual, religious sister might say, or something like that, or even an individual bishop. And there are times when, you may hear something from your local priest, which actually is just not true. It's actually not the teaching of the church. You may hear that from, the nun who taught you in grade school, or even from an individual bishop. And I think that, like, disassociating those things can be sort of challenging sometimes, because, like, okay, my only contact or experience with the church is primarily this priest or this nun, and this is what she's telling me. And, and this is also where, the church's teaching is very different from what you might hear from some evangelicals, right? So you'll talk to some evangelical Christians who will say, like, I know definitively who is going to hell and who is going to heaven. Like, if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, then you're damned forever. And what the church says is, one, we begin with the fact that, we'll start with other Christians, that they certainly, we can see visibly that they see and recognize elements of the truth of things. It's partial, but there's still some of it there, and that we need to begin with that in our relationship with people and our engagement with people, particularly our fellow Christians. By virtue of our common baptism, there's sort of a communion there with them. So there is something true, but then ranging even broader, you've got the Muslim or the Jew or the Hindu or whoever. There is something true in there. It's not the fullness of truth, and say there are aspects of it that are in error, but there is something there that's true. And let's sort of start with that as our kind of common foundation. And then ranging even more broadly, people who are, atheists or agnostics, but who are, striving to live virtuous lives. And even though they may deny the existence of God and, whatever it may be, there are aspects of what they believe and how they live that are actually true, good and true and beautiful. And so ultimately we don't, we say, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. Very clear about that. And, Catholic, this is one of the more sort of the harder teachings of the church, is when the church says, like, there is one church. There are other Christian communities, but there's sort of one true church. But what we don't do is take the extra step and say, I or we know definitively where someone is going to end up ultimately and eternally, that ultimately that judgment is reserved for God.
So, yeah, so sweet Mrs. Levine may very well be okay.
It's quite possible. I don't know. I mean, couldn't say, let's hope she is, couldn't say one way or the other.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sort of detract from the church's kind of truth claims, but it basically, we're not putting ourselves in the throne of God. We're not putting ourselves in the judgment seat about, so ultimately, who goes to heaven and who does not. So I would say that's one thing. In terms of other religions, ultimately, as you mentioned, my career sort of took me to Capitol Hill. I'm now a congressional staffer working for this really sort of interesting bipartisan, bicameral entity. There is bipartisanship. It lives on Capitol Hill, and we can talk about more about that in a bit. But I'm a senior policy advisor focused on religious freedom, mostly in Europe and Central Asia, former Soviet Union, a little bit in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as a little bit in the United States. And ultimately, it's either religious freedom for all or it's religious freedom for none. Mm-hmm. And it's not that error itself has sort of rights, but people have the freedom and should have the freedom to explore things as they see fit. And it shouldn't be coerced. Faith is a gift. It's a gift freely given, and it's a gift freely received and responded to, and it cannot and should not ever be coerced on someone. And so, much of my career has spent, I'm fighting for the Muslims of Iraq or Uzbekistan and Jehovah's Witnesses and people whose theology, the church and I would say at least is in part in error, but that doesn't take away from the fact that these people have worth and dignity and need to kind of pursue the truth of things. So I have meetings with people all the time who, are there because they're persecuted, whose theology I think is wildly off the mark, but that doesn't detract from their just inherent dignity in the fact that, they have a right to not be tortured and to not be detained and to not have their children taken away because the government thinks that they are part of some sort of strange religious group. So no incompatibility there whatsoever.
Well, I think it's easy to fall into the trap to think that someone that has taken a path that you have taken, I think it's easy to assume, well, he's become a zealot, and how could he possibly do the work he does? But I think also one of the great tragedies that we have in the United States and beyond is that there's I think this just horrific notion that because I and this other person may disagree about something that is sort of, like a core matter of, the nature of the human person or reality or God or whatever it may be, or politics, you name it, that one, reducing the person to that, and two, like, I can't have a relationship with this person, which is absurd. And you can have people that have very closely, fervent views about things and still be friends and still recognize that, like, you have worth and dignity and, we can have a relationship with each other. So, I'm zealous in so much as I'm an Orthodox Catholic, I'm a faithful Catholic. But it doesn't sort of just the opposite. It actually opens me up to, I think, deeper relationships and friendships with people, including people who, see things very differently from me. Well, I'll be honest. There have been times over the years as you've gone down this path that you've pissed me off, and it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed that I still consider you a friend.
And I think this is really, a really important point because, when ultimately part of being a Christian, and hopefully this is true of everybody, but it's ultimately desiring someone else's good, rooted in something that's sort of objective and true, not just sort of my whim or emotions or will or the other person's, whim or wills or emotions. And so that may sometimes mean saying something that someone doesn't want to hear. It's not sort of, and I think this is back to the reaction that people sometimes have where, like, you're telling me something that I just don't want to hear. At the end of the day, the other person may not persuade you, but at least there's a recognition at best, there's a recognition, like, you're doing this out of love. I may disagree with you. I may, for all these sort of reasons, but that's what it's rooted in. And I think that aspect sometimes gets missed, and whether it's friends or family or colleagues, they end up not talking to each other, or you end up having these sort of horrific battles when, okay, I may disagree with you about this, but I know that it's rooted in a desire for my good.
Yeah, I guess I think some of it could come from, and I don't know, you and I haven't kept in close contact, so I don't know if what I'm about to say is true or not, but a very far outsider's perspective was early on, as you became Catholic, there seemed to be a desire to spread the word, so to speak. I feel like in the times when if I had gotten upset about something you had sent me over email or something, it felt like, well, is he trying to change me, or he's trying to convert me, or what's going on there, versus just, well, let me live my life. If I'm not bothering you, what do you care?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's still the case or if you've changed. And I think that's the story I always tell, not always tell, but the example I give to friends when I talk about my friendship with you was, I had made a joke to you over email. Well, I've been living in sin with my girlfriend for a few years. And then in true Nathaniel Hurd form, I got back a 17-page email of all the reasons why cohabitation before marriage was not right. And my first reaction was, who the hell does this guy think he is? What does he care? And I understood that as someone who was going down the path you were going, you wanted to share what you knew. So I didn't take total offense to it, other than just to say, dude, leave me alone. So I think that's where sometimes that can happen, is if it feels like it's preaching,
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So I guess there are maybe two things. One, I'm smiling about the 17-page email, and I think my wife would find that very amusing. Well, because like, wait a minute, we're dating and you're sending me emails with footnotes in them. Like, who does this? This is
well, again, I mean, it was I took joy in just knowing that, well, that is the Nathaniel I know. It was well researched, and
Yeah, very vintage, thorough, maybe too thorough. So this is really interesting. I guess it's this idea that there aren't aspects of our life which, like, we just can't talk about. That, it's true that there are, kind of privacy and so on, but that, you would want, like, if somebody that I knew saw me doing something that they thought was sort of off the mark and maybe harmful to me in certain ways, or to other people, that they would say something, and ultimately, I will make a judgment about whether or not I sort of concur with them. But, at the very least, I'm glad you said something. I disagree with you, but, I understand kind of where it's coming from. And it's this idea that there isn't an aspect of life that is sort of like hermetically sealed. We just don't go anywhere near. So I guess that was part of it. There is sort of the bigger question about prudence, right? So, I mean, in terms of, like, any faithful Catholic should want the entire world to be Catholic. Like, that is the desire of the church. Now, in terms of, relationships and conversations, how do you talk about things? When do you talk about things? There's a whole domain of prudence there, prudential judgment. Is sending a 17-page email necessarily the most effective thing? Probably not. Would I do it now? Probably not. This comes with being married and, having your wife temper you somewhat. So I think, it's not that, this wouldn't necessarily engage, but, the timing might be different, might be, hey, could we have a phone conversation? It might just sort of come at it in a different way. It's not, and this is the other thing too, is that it's not, you would hear this from a Catholic, and I suppose you would hear this from a Jew or a Muslim as well, but it isn't, I'm sort of giving you my kind of personal take on something. There's actually something sort of objective here, and I'm, trying to sort of make the case for that objective thing, not just, I don't approve, or,
Sure.
I think, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
So
I guess
that would be maybe a little bit of a distinction.
And I guess the core of it is belief, right? If you believe in a certain thing and someone else believes in a different thing, certainly wars have been fought over that. And I think that's what
they have indeed.
Too.
Yeah. So I think, I've certainly sort of tempered over the years. It still, it certainly has come up in the context of family and, other friends, et cetera. And I've engaged, but, in a somewhat in a somewhat different and hopefully slightly more winsome way.
Well, that's good. Look, that's good. And we still can be friends.
Absolutely.
You'll forgive me for living with my wife before we were married.
It is not for me to forgive or not forgive.
I knew you were going to say that. So you mentioned the current.
That's called a softball.
So you mentioned your current work. Foreign policy hasn't, at least publicly, been a focus of this outgoing administration. Has that hindered your ability to get work done, or?
I mean, it's funny. As this goes back partially to the news coverage, the most sort of contentious stuff tends to be domestic, and so that kind of takes up a lot of the air in the room, and somewhat understandably. I mean, it's the United States, and this is where we live, and you're the president of the United States, not of the world. But certainly, every president is sort of active on foreign policy in different ways. They emphasize different things. They take different approaches to things. I mean, whoever the administration is, you sort of work with them as best you can. And obviously, at times, I work for members of Congress, and so sometimes that'll be adversarial, even if it's a Republican in the White House and I'm, serving a Republican senator, or if it's a Democrat in the White House and I'm working with a Democratic member of the House. Sometimes that's just the nature of our system of government. Sometimes we work very closely with the executive branch as well. So there's always work. I will say that, we talked a lot at the beginning about friendships and just relationships with people. I have come to conclude that in some respects, the most important thing about my work is not the bills that I draft. It's not the things that I write for members of Congress. It's none of that. It's just the encounters that I have with people. It's the relationships I develop with people. It's, the person who is from part of Ukraine who is occupied by Russia, who's been, imprisoned and tortured and comes into the Helsinki Commission to meet with me. It's the conversation that I have with that person that's actually the most important aspect of my work. It's the relationships that I develop with my, the friendships I have with my colleagues or other people on the Hill or folks at nonprofits that I work with very, very closely. That's actually more important. I think, it's so easy to become obsessed with national politics and what's happening at kind of this big 30,000 foot level, when most of the work happens at the local level. It's one conversation at a time. It's this conversation we're having right now. It's a conversation with family over, at Thanksgiving or Christmas. It's talking to your neighbor. It's helping your neighbor. That's actually the most important. It's your city council who makes decisions all the time that have, a big impact in your life. And yet, how much time do I spend paying attention to the city council versus, what's happening in Washington? So that, presidents come and go, administrations come and go. That is a constant.
Yeah. So it's come up quite a few times on the show, conversations with folks, of the importance of local politics, local government. So looking back as you think back to
a time when I had hair.
Yes. And if I
so
remember
long ago,
and if I remember correctly, you're in your Facebook picture when it was an actual physical book and not a billion-dollar tech company.
Right. It was actually called the Facebook.
It was the Facebook. That's right. With snow in your hair in your Facebook picture, if I remember.
So funny thing
snowy Facebook picture you had.
So this is the thing. So that photo was originally a color photo. I was standing outside the chapel of the boarding school that I went to. Snow was coming down. Somebody took a picture. I thought, that's kind of a neat looking picture. What I did not know was that when I sent it to Hamilton, it was going to be cropped and black and white. So I looked like the guy that had the worst dandruff problem in the entire class.
I remember.
Yeah. I was that guy. Yeah.
If you could go back and think about those times, is there anything you wish you had known? Looking back with the most interesting path you've taken. Anything you wish you had known when you're on that campus?
So, I knew you were going to ask me this question. Damn you, Dave Bulger. Damn you. And I've thought a lot about it. And, you're going to laugh because I'm going to tell sort of a churchy story, but I think it's sort of a helpful one. There's this part of one of the Gospels where Jesus is walking and he's risen from the dead and he's walking with his disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he sort of keeps them from seeing him. And it's such a weird passage. Like, wait a minute, these are your disciples and they're hoping to see you, and you're kind of keeping them from, like, why is this? So I was at Mass once, and a priest was preaching actually on this gospel, and he told a very personal story about kind of his vocation as a priest. And he talked about going to a lunch with a priest many years ago when he was a younger man. And it was this sort of conversation that sort of really sparked him thinking about the priesthood, and, was sort of the catalyst for, obviously a lot of things had to happen after that, but it was really a catalyst for him embarking on a life that led to the priesthood. And he said in this homily, if I had known at that time that that's where it was going to lead, I never would have gone to the lunch. And I think a lot of us have probably had experiences like that as well, where something was like we didn't understand why we knew something or didn't know something, and yet we realized later, oh, that's why. I think about my wife. I think about the 3 years after leaving seminary, before she and I met and started dating. And the women that I was in relationships with, and the ones who said yes to going out with me, and the ones who said no, and the breakups and everything else, all of it was sort of preparing me for and pointing me toward meeting my wife and marrying my wife. Now, if you'd asked me at the time, especially after like an especially bad breakup or something like that, so is this great? No, this is not great. This is awful. It sucks. But realizing now that there was actually a good in that. And so, in terms of Hamilton, I'm not sure there is. Things sort of happened as they were supposed to. There were things that I knew and didn't know that led me to make certain decisions, and you could sort of say, okay, because of that, then this, then this, then this, and this, and this, and here I am. And if I had known something then, I might have made different decisions, and the outcomes would have been very different. So in that respect, just grateful for even for things that at the time may have been uncomfortable or unpleasant. Just grateful for it.
All right, that's Nathaniel Hurd, class of 1999. When he was sharing his story, I was reminded of the song I Believe in the musical The Book of Mormon. Now, of course, so much of that is poking fun at Mormonism, and this song in particular lists things that we're supposed to think are just these wacky things that Mormons believe. And I don't bring it up to poke fun at Nathaniel or and his beliefs, because I don't. There's a line in the song where a missionary is giving himself a pep talk to continue his work. It's something along the lines of, you cannot believe in things part way, you have to believe in them all. And hearing Nathaniel talk about how he approached his faith, it was the first time I had heard him talk about it in that way, and it made me understand a bit more about how he's approached his faith. He believes. If you're going to believe this, then you believe in it all. Then you follow the teachings. And while I don't share in those beliefs, I respect that he does. And it was good to have a conversation with him on that level and reconnect with him in that way. So my thanks to Nathaniel for joining this week. We're going to take a bit of a holiday break on the show, but we'll be back in the new year with new episodes. Got a lot of great guests lined up, working on some fun ideas. I hope you don't miss me too much. Of course, if you get lonely, you can go to hadiknown.buzzsprout.com. Again, hadiknown.buzzsprout.com, and listen to any one of the past episodes and catch up if you've missed any of those. We'll still be active on social media, Had I Known Show. So if you have any thoughts on what you want to see or hear or experience in the new year from Had I Known, hit us up there. Let us know what your wants and needs are. Love to connect with you. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. hadiknown.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying music on this show. And once again this week, we highlight music from a Hamilton alum. This week, it's Bo Armstrong, class of 2009. Bo's latest album is called Chasing Ballads. We're going to feature a song from that album called Here's Looking at You, Kid. You can hear all of Bo's music on Spotify, or you can go to boarmstrongmusic.com. Again, boarmstrongmusic.com, where you can learn more about Bo and his music. And if you're looking for a last-minute holiday gift, why not get Chasing Ballads on vinyl? There's nothing like vinyl, folks. What a gift opportunity right there. So have a listen to this song, and then go on over to boarmstrongmusic.com and pick it up on vinyl. This is Here's Looking at You, Kid, from Bo Armstrong, class of 2009. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you had a wonderful Hanukkah, if that's your thing. Hope you have a Merry Christmas, if that's your thing. I hope you have a wonderful holiday in whatever way you celebrate it. And we'll talk to you in 2021.
Son, let me tell you a story about a boy who was trying to be a man. Just a young hotshot who was sitting on top of the world he was living in. Didn't have a clue, I didn't know about you. I'd hit the town and knock a few down, take somebody home. Another notch in the bell, a prize on the shelf, a name I didn't know, and there'd been a few. But I'm breaking through to the games I played and hard mistakes that led me here to you, to the bitter trail of heartaches and every sorry yes excuse. What I was ain't what I am, and I ain't hiding from the past. But I'll raise a glass to all the days ahead. Here's looking at you, kid. Times I rolled the dice and walked away alone. Now I'm trading in my reckless heart for restless nights at home, and it's just as well, but I'm scared as hell. I never dreamed I'd see the things I see when I see you. And boy, it seems that we both got some growing up to do. I took my time, now you're mine. To the games I played and hard mistakes that led me here to you, to the bitter trail of heartaches and every sorry yes excuse. What I was ain't what I am, and I ain't hiding from the past. But I'll raise a glass to all the days ahead. Here's looking at you, kid. Those days are disappearing, baby. Now I'm seeing clearly for the first time in a while. That man I wanna be, I pray that he can hang around this time. To the games I played and hard mistakes that led me here to you, to the bitter trail of heartaches and every sorry yes excuse. What I was ain't what I am, and
podcast show on your radio or take it to go.